Okay, that's that. Done. So the next thing I want to do is share with you my screen. So come on. Okay, that's not what I want. There we go. Okay. Okay. Can you see in front of you a pyramid?
Yes.
Then thank you, Sir Howard. This is to me the root of all evil. And so what I just want to share with you is for purposes of framing our conversation, in the 1900s, this was the necessary model for facilitating manufacturing in the Industrial Revolution. People left the farms to go work in the big city for companies, which were new entities that were structured in a very command control fashion so that we can maximize employee productivity in a manufacturing society, right? You had a few at the top. We refer to them lovingly these days as the C-suite. You had a lot of layers of bureaucracy that were by necessity built in, called middle management, which was a necessary buffer between those at the top and what we'll just refer to as frontline staff who were responsible for getting the work done and interacting with clients. And as you both know, this model has lasted into the 21st century. But thank goodness it's dying. And in its place is a more, shall we say, distributed, less structural, less tiramisu kind of cake, fewer layers, where we pull out all of those unnecessary layers of management and we create a flatter matrix organization. And that's predicated on people working in teams by themselves, collaboratively. And so what's happening is you've got thousands, tens of thousands of boomers and matures leaving the workforce every day, some willingly, many unwillingly, but there's been a reconstitution of the American workforce where larger segments of younger, less tenured professionals, millennials and Gen Zs, are taking over. And organizations that understand how to maximize employee performance are restructuring around this thing called teams. And even the idea of teams is changing. So there are these world-class organizations at places like Nucor Steel and Wegmans and Patagonia and DuPont and Gore, and they're all restructuring from the notion of teams to what we call agile teams. The distinction being, in a traditional team, you had people who are project leads. And they were the ones who were anointed as the experts in facilitating teamwork. But now what's shifting is because of technology, because of the rate of transformational change, because of competition being global, because of things evolving so quickly, we don't have any opportunity. World-class organizations are shifting the model of teamwork from traditional teams to agile teams. And all agile means is everybody conceivably can have a leadership role and or a major project lead capacity on any given project as the work comes in. So we're seeing these things that are happening in the workforce where you have less of a pyramid command control, more distributed, flatter organizations, entrepreneurs and startups in their 20s and 50s who are building these new entities around agile teams and collaboration. Oh, and then you have a global pandemic, which fucks everything up. People are now figuring out how to create engaged teams when people are working virtually and or hybrid remote schedules. So all of this is evolving, and needless to say, ownership, new leadership teams, entrepreneurs, they have no idea how to put this together effectively. They're still operating on a 20th century mindset, and that's what I'm hoping with this series of weekly Ask Me Anything events is to talk about these topics around empowering employees. So I'm going to just open up the floor and just see what you're encountering what you're experiencing. Maybe you serve on boards, so they're struggling with this. Like, what is, gentlemen, your experience with this shifting workplace environment been?
I think you see this more and more where you have a hybrid work and remote teams,
Hmm.
uh, because one of the things that can get in the way of those teams is that sense of control that that pyramid structure gives the people at the top, that they kind of need to let go of and put faith in the people that are doing the work and be more inspirational than they are directive. I think that more traditional models that require in-person work, whether or not that work's actually required to be in person, are less adaptive to that because they're too used to sitting on the pyramid structure, and the people that are in those upper echelons, especially with in larger corporations, um, don't see the value of restructuring away from that pyramid, because they've become so disconnected from that through that middle management layer to the people that are actually doing the work, that they have no visibility to what the needs of those teams are. And they are defaulting to their hierarchical structure that they're used to. And it's one of those things where when they try and implement something like this, because they're not fully on board to begin with, rather than seeing why are certain things going wrong, they blame it on a model that they didn't think was going to work to begin with. So when you see smaller companies kind of do this and have success with it and build their teams, um, they grow and then they eventually get acquired by private equity. And once it gets to private equity, now they're shoehorned into that pyramid model because they feel it's more efficient.
I'm going to reserve my statements of vitriol for the profession that is private equity. So I'll kind of table that angst and just ask Jervis your observations as well. I mean, Thomas makes like a number of critically important points. I mean, just to kind of recap, how does leadership give up control when they're still built on that kind of control model? And then how do you build and you didn't say it, Thomas, but how do you build and maintain culture when more people are working remotely and spread out? And then is there a thought based on what Thomas said about if people on the top are so hesitant to give up control, don't you need to recruit for an entirely new set of ideal employee characteristics? Like we need to find new talent.
I mean, I think the unfortunate tension is between what we know works better and what has worked for the majority of the current leadership in our workforce. And so what you're proposing has, in many cases, demonstrably better outcomes, but a lot of the leaders that we work with won't won't take it seriously because it's not how they've ever done things. And
Right.
so that can be frustrating for everyone. But I think what's so interesting is while private equity deserves a lot of vitriol, private equity is now shifting towards human capital strategy as a way to produce outsized returns. And the largest consulting firms, Deloitte, McKinsey, Accenture, et cetera, are spending literally billions of dollars. McKinsey and Deloitte both made a $1 billion promise to build human capital strategy divisions within their practices because everybody is recognizing that this is an area of, candidly, it's an area of failure in our current system. And so if you can, you know, make even modest gains in culture and or people strategy, you can produce outsized returns. And I'll provide some examples. So KKR, the largest private equity firm in the country, has a division now run by Pete Stavros that every time they acquire a company, they give a portion of the company to the employees. What they figured out is that you buy a company, you give 20% of it to the employees, and the gains that produces will make the 80% they have left worth more than the 100% they bought. So it's scary actually that things are so bad that private equity has figured out that there are levers that they can pull. Another group is called irrational capital.
Yep.
That there are levers that they can pull, and they use the same tactics over and over and over again. They don't customize it. They don't, this is private equity, right? We're going to cookie cutter our strategies. There's a new private equity firm called Nine Dean, like there are 9 deans of the business school, that was funded by nonprofits that's going to do the same thing. It's all about strategic human capital investment to achieve outsized returns. So my response to that is, geez, if the numbers guys, the unfeeling, I don't give a damn about anyone, I want to make as much money as I possibly can, guys have figured out that this is a way to increase business valuation, productivity, and profitability, that should be screaming to the rest of us that we are really, really screwing the pooch here, because these guys have figured out that this is an area of improvement that they can execute on. And I don't think, I love Thomas's language, inspirational versus directive. I don't know many private equity guys that think of themselves as inspirational. They're all directive. And if they feel like they can achieve outsized returns just by incorporating human capital strategy through directive, man, we are really missing the boat.
And yet, I think what you're saying, which is so on point, is therein lies the opportunity, as we now have decades of research into organizational behavior and best practice, that if the private equity folks are understanding that that's how they maximize value in their portfolios, their holdings of companies, by starting to invest in employees, I think that shows that you can start to see the battleship turning in terms of corporate mindset. It's funny you mentioned irrational capital, because Bart Houlihan, who developed the B Corp, Great Place to Work certification model, he came on my podcast and we talked at length about the value now of putting control in these organizations back to their employees. And same conversation I had with Bill Coffin, who's the managing editor at Ethisphere. We talked about what you're saying, Jervis, about if folks in the consulting realm are starting to see employee ROI as something that you can measure. And to both of your points, I see this in the valuation space, right? People who I've spoken to who do business valuations pre-transaction, pre-merger, pre-deal, they're starting to look at how do you monetarily measure culture, right? In terms of equity, in terms of branding equity. So it's nice to see that folks in respective arenas are starting to see the value of measuring employee performance, productivity, profitability, and the value of culture, which to me is fascinating that you point that out.
Yeah, it's as I've been looking for roles, there's a definite, I would say, hybridization of the model that you described in your presentation, and the old model, the top-down model. So what I'm seeing more of, and this is just anecdotal, I don't have any data on this, in the companies that I've been applying to or having interviews with, is sort of a hybrid approach there, like an EOS approach, where you still have a hierarchy, even within teams, but everybody owns something. So everybody has agency, everybody has independence, and you work collaboratively to solve problems and move things forward, sort of in a non-hierarchical manner, but there's still a person leading the team, and a lot of these organizations are still looking for traditional project management skills to be the team leaders there. I don't know how that will evolve.
I will tell you how it will evolve, because not to jump in, but to interrupt you. How it's going to evolve is there's a different definition of a project lead, meaning on a team, there's no one role that's dedicated to project lead anymore. It just won't exist. So it's a team of incredibly competent people who are hired not because they have the requisite skill sets, because that's hard to gauge as things transform more quickly. There are people who have already demonstrated a prior track record of success, leading, motivating, communication, activity in the communities they live in. They've done volunteer work. They've taken gap years. They have cultural diversity in their pocket. They speak multiple languages. Those are the things that they're now going to be looking to leverage that skill set. The work on the job, you can train that. In fact, you're going to have to. You can't go and find people with extensive experience because there's so much uncertainty. So on a project lead basis, yes, they're going to have some combination of traditional project leadership management skills, but they're going to have a significant number of what other folks pejoratively would say are soft skills. Emotional intelligence, effective communication, leadership. They can work independently. They're intrinsically motivated. They have a growth mindset. They're lifelong learners. And guess what? If Thomas was interviewing them, he would, in behavioral interviewing, look for those qualities and characteristics. He'll teach them the work on the job because that's the only choice he has. Like, what are your thoughts on that, Thomas? Because I mean, we're talking about so much more than just the notion of project leadership. We're talking about actually a new model.
Yeah.
If you think, Jervis, about what you're saying, there's the 20th century for-profit, which thank God it's dying. And then there's the historical not-for-profit designation. And then there's now we're looking at places like Chef Jose Andreas and World Central Kitchen. We're looking at profit with a purpose as a third entity. You know, a triple bottom line and all this other stuff. What are your gentlemen's thoughts on this new model?
So if you look at where my career path went, working for a financial institution and coming over to supporting strategies, I think people are gravitating more to that newer model. That what you're seeing, but what you're also seeing is that newer model is much easier to build from scratch, or to implement in younger companies, because you don't have the institutional foundations that are based on another model that goes against this grain.
Is that just very quickly, is that what Jervis was alluding to before when he said there may be some hesitation of people who feel discomfort because they're not familiar with the model?
I think it goes beyond that. I think that when first of all, when you have that layer of middle management that is now becoming redundant, they're going to try and sabotage that model because they don't have the position of authority in that new model that they like happening. I think we see some of this in places like Chase, for example, and Wells Fargo, when they're insisting that everyone gets back to the office. Well, why did they come to that decision? Well, their middle managers have said, we need to do that to hold people accountable. Why do they need to do that to hold people accountable? Well, they need to do that because the way they're very directive in their approach, and quite frankly, they don't have the leadership skills that their role requires to begin with. So when you have that middle management layer, they have more direct access to the people at the top than the bottom. You have that resistance that's there. So if you build this newer model before you've built in that middle management layer, you take out one of the big roadblocks that prevents that from happening. And the other part of that is that, especially in these larger, older companies, you already have a foundation based on this, and the people at the top don't want to, they're older, they're more established in their careers, and they're less open to change or to trying new things. Even if you show them data that other companies have done this, other companies have had success with that, they still have it in their mindset of, we've been doing this for 3 decades. We're a successful company. This is not a problem. We don't want to implement this. Even though the problems are clear to be shown, they're stuck in their own heads doing that in those senior leadership roles. And in order for something for this to take root in an older, more established, larger company, you need to get people with mindset into this newer model, into those C-suite level positions to implement it. And and again, these are the same people that are deciding who their successors are going to be, which are generally people in those middle managers who are the most resistant to this model to begin with. Now, what
So-
you'll see is these more younger, more agile companies, as they grow, as they put into this model, they will take over these other larger companies, their market share, they'll outperform them, they'll be more innovative, and they'll be far more competitive. And they're the ones that will attract the talent because they're going to be able to build that company culture that everyone's looking for. They're going to be able to give that flatter workplace and more delegative of authority to the workforce rather than assigned roles. They're going to be able to bring on those inspirational leaders because they're going to see at a much earlier stage the benefits that that provides.
I hear
And
everything you're both saying, and yet what organizations should be doing but are fighting, resisting doing because there's a power struggle going on,
Yes.
a desire to hold on to control, a desire to not trust your people, a desire to not give control up to your people. What you're both saying, let me be very realistic, is happening. And the organizations who are refusing to adapt will die. In fact,
Yes.
they are dying as more nimble thinking, forward-thinking individuals are creating new organizational entities that bring newer people in and can be much more capable of stealing market share, responding to what's happening in the market, and succeeding. So you're both
And that's
saying
exactly what's going to drive adoption of the newer model. But unfortunately, that's going to take more time.
Understood. But when you have, as Jervis has said, and you have the largest consulting firms and private equity firms and people who do deal flow, when they get it, when they see the decades of data that supports the idea that you want to succeed by giving up control and giving up power and creating an organization that invests in this, once they get it, and you see new businesses who are literally stealing market share by building equity doing this, these companies are going to go out of business, right? It's happening now.
Yep.
So how do you convince organizations to change, if not for altruistic reasons, for survival reasons? I mean, I know in my world, I've been spending 17 years literally coming up with how you show the data. But even that doesn't move the needle always. So how do you both, in your worlds, do this? Because it's a challenge. Jervis, thoughts? Thomas, thoughts?
So when potential clients are that resistant to change, they don't become our clients. I think that what you can probably assess in the marketplace is that people need less convincing, and for a lack of a better term, they need the FAFO, right? And that's what's going to create the ecosystem that when bigger companies start to fail because they have not been adopting this model, that will light a fire under the remaining companies to say, if we don't change, we're going to be them. They need to see what the consequences are, not what the potential consequences are.
However, with what you've both said, and I agree with so much of it, what you said is there won't be an honest come to Jesus moment where somebody who's in a position of authority and control will say, the reason that we failed or are struggling is because our model is not set to leverage our people. So there's always some kind of permutation of excuse, right?
Yes.
Supply chain issues, tariff wars. There's a war on talent, or Gen Zs these days. Don't get me started on that one. But so it's all outer directed. It's all external excuse driven. It's not looking in the mirror of our leadership team has failed. So you're not going to have that moment of prescient acknowledgement. So what you're saying is organizations need to fail and newer models need to scale. And I know for a fact that's happening because I still teach college students. And that's what they're talking about
Yep.
doing. They literally have said things like, I'm not going to look for a job because the jobs don't exist. Companies aren't loyal. I'm going to literally get together with one or two of my fellow students and do something. And
Mhm.
that's how they approach it. People in the end, the middle or end of their careers, that's a different conversation.
And I think that's when you see the rise of fractional professional businesses, that's a symptom of that, right? That people are like, hey, I know I have the leadership skills, I want the quality of life, I want that flatter structure, and I can't get it in corporate America. So I can give that back by taking my expertise and implementing that. That's going to be one of the agents of change to help with that, because more larger and larger companies are going to rely on that fractional leadership, and they're going to come in and they're going to be able to say, "Hey, I'm an outsider. There's no risk of me
I,
saying this to you. You're failing, and this is why."
and here's my question for you both. The idea of a fractional professional
Mhm.
as an outside objective resource, an arbiter to be brought in and give guidance, strategic guidance on a path forward. How does that work in practical terms when so many millions of American employees are rebranding themselves as fractionals? The model of the pyramid command control, as we've just said before, is dying, which
Yep.
means fewer layers of those senior level management positions, and
Mhm.
then fewer people, therefore, in positions of control at the top. And then all of this kind of groundswell movement of people from the workforce, just basically fractional consultants. It's not a sustainable, viable model for labor, especially with AI. I mean,
Yes, and
we're seeing magnitude of scale of what AI has done. It's already imploded industries. It's removed whole professions off the table, and we're just at the tip of that iceberg.
but when you look historically, it's just another round in the cycle of efficiencies that as tools get better built in. We went through this
This
when
one's fundamentally different. This one is fundamentally different. I agree with you. The internet, social media platforms, I agree with you, but this one looks fundamentally different.
I think because the capabilities are different and the way that it can be employed is different. But when you get to the root of it all, um, you're already starting to see some of the cracks in what the current iteration of AI can do. You're seeing hallucinations. You're seeing that when the AI gets bad data, it produces bad results. And so you either have to restrict that data or you have to develop AI to have a sense of judgment. And we are light years away from that happening. So,
I'm gonna respectfully disagree, but I do want to shift the focus because
yeah,
I'm literally every conversation I have every day seems like somebody who's a fractional chief marketing officer, or virtual, they run a virtual administration firm. Everybody I talk to is literally gone out of business, is going out of business, or literally throwing their business model up in the air and refiguring it out on the fly. So I'm seeing it constantly. But I do want to switch gears and ask you both. We're talking at a very, I believe, important high level in terms of organizational transformation because we need to. But I'm really fascinated with your experiences on the people side because this is creating a whole new model for employee-employer engagement, and the nature of the relationship of the contract is changing, right? So I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of the new dynamic, especially with those kooky kids called Gen Zs and millennials taking over.
I mean, I think, there's a lot of uncertainty here, right? Are we on the front end of a wave that you're describing, Ethan, or is this another, trend that's going to change forever the workplace, but maybe not transform it? And, so the answer to that question is I don't want to sound doom and gloom, but capitalism is failing. And what you just said about your students is true. And what millennials and in even greater numbers Gen Z have figured out is that work is not as valuable as it used to be. So if I want to go work for a corporation or even a small company, candidly, I don't see small business leaders having more courage for change necessarily than large businesses, unfortunately. Even though they have the ability to be more agile, they don't take advantage of that. And by the way, what has to change? One of the things that has to change, and I don't want to go down this pathway now, but one of the things that has to change for this to bring some healing to capitalism is business school, because as long as business school is only focused on the obvious and tangible line items on the P&L, we're never going to see the shift towards human capital investment that doesn't show up on the P&L as directly as other line items do. So, but like I said, I don't want to go down that rabbit trail. But they don't want to work, not because they're unmotivated or they're lazy or they're stupid or, their parents coddle them. They don't want to work because they've realized that this paycheck that 40 years ago when we were kids was the promise of a home, maybe even a vacation home, if you worked, a retirement, a pension. It was the promise of economic progress. Work used to be the promise of economic progress. It is not that anymore. In many cases, it's survival, or it's going backwards, or it's, and I think you just said, you said something earlier, Ethan, that's very true. Companies aren't loyal anymore, and they're not building mechanisms to enhance and, in large part, enhance and encourage loyalty. So we need to see some structural changes to the way capitalism operates if we're going to find success systemically and prevent my kids from living through a violent revolution, which I really hope doesn't happen. But and like I said, I know that sounds gloomy, but if you look at historical trends, we're headed squarely in that direction. Of the vast majority of Americans do not feel like work is a pathway to progress anymore, and that's problematic.
I so honor the both of you, and I so deeply appreciate, Jervis, what you just kind of framed as far as a very soft underbelly topic that I quite frankly am really pissed isn't being talked about more. And I give you both an example in my world of being on LinkedIn constantly and trying to talk about this thing, Jervis, that you just alluded to, which is the death of capitalism. I tried not to say that at the onset today, but that's kind of where I was going. The notion today of one employer for life. I graduate from college, I go out there, I get a job, maybe in my career or professionally, there's a trajectory, but there's ultimately a promise that my life is going to be better because I followed along through these expected process. That's dead, right? Like, and I see this, amen. I've taught over 5,000 students over the last 17 years in 12 colleges and universities. I've seen this manifestation of that. They look out and they see what's happening every day with companies, banks, financial services, insurance, hedge funds, private equity, healthcare, pharmaceutical. They're seeing example after example after example of there's no loyalty. My life is not going to be better than my parents or grandparents. Spending $250,000 on a worthless piece of paper called the college degree, there's no guarantee that I'm going to. And now Gen Zs and millennials are saying, I want a new contract. I want a new life. I want health and wellness. I have expectations that your company's going to behave and act equitably. You're going to have the same values I do. Don't give me your bullshit marketing spin as your formal culture. I want to see you in action. I don't want you to be Wells Fargo or Bank of America where you steal my parents' and grandparents' money. I don't want you to be British Petroleum where you set aside a line item in your budget every year for lawsuits from the families of your dead employees. Like, there's a whole new model. And yeah, it's Giovanni and kind and all of these, honesty, they're all doing it, right? I've had them on my podcast. I've done. Oh shit, just let's talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, shall we, on the corporate side? Do you want to go there? Boeing,
I
Harley
think
Davidson.
but I think it goes even deeper than that, in that the way that capitalism has kind of grown is that if you have a bit of money, there are so many ways to game the system without work that it almost feels like, for the younger generations, that work is a sucker's game. And they see these Bitcoin investors like Mr. Beast, for example, design the life that they want because they figured out a lever that they could pull. And if you have capital, you're taxed at a lower rate and you can gain far more income by investing that capital rather than doing the work. It's almost if you have the money to set up passive income, that is more valuable than working to create your money. And then you throw on top of that things like YouTube influencers and things
I
of
was
that
just
nature.
going to go there. My students, well before Bitcoin ever came on the scene, were talking about the ability to the Kardashian model
Yeah.
of creating an influencer model where you're being compensated on a monthly basis, where you can be anywhere. And
Yep.
you can literally, as long as you have a laptop and an internet connection, you can talk about travel, you can talk about culture, you can talk about fashion, doesn't matter. But you're right. The suckers game, I think you alluded to, goes back to what Jervis is saying, right? The notion of the employee-employer contract they see was a joke. And I point to millennials because look at their age, born between 80 and 96. They came of age in 2007 to 2008. Remember what happened in 2007 to 2008? Where these corporations were literally stealing money, foreclosing on their parents' and grandparents' homes. They came of age seeing that. That whole notion of going to work for an employer and believing falsely that they cared about you, that, Jervis, I interpret what you're saying as that's now no longer a viable model for that.
Yeah, and that's what leaders haven't yet embraced, right? Because that wasn't their experience. So if you're pre-millennial, your experience with the world is, if I go to work, even if it's for 9 different companies in my career, that paycheck is going to empower the life I want. That's your experience. And it's very hard.
That was the Gen Xer model. Yes.
Yeah.
Those of us.
It's very hard to detach yourself from that model now and realize that doesn't work anymore. I mean, in the 80s, we spent 25% less of our paychecks on healthcare. We had pensions. You could buy a home with 3 years worth of income. Now it's where I live, it's 7. And all the things that Thomas mentioned with regard to capital and the abuse of capital as sort of the rigged game, have been hugely impactful on that. Like books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or The Millionaire Next Door, which were like revelatory and pretty awesome to create wealth for a lot of people. We're also in a position where in my state, again, I don't know what the national statistics are, but 1/4 of the single family homes in our state are owned by investors. What does that do to the price for everybody else? It drives it up.
Actually, nationally, it's a third.
Okay, so what we're seeing is this fundamental breakdown of the contract, and I think that's exactly the right language. The contract used to be, if you work, you will prosper. And that contract is broken. And we have to find a way to fix it, because now there may be some other form of economy that exists that humans haven't thought of yet. But historically, all of the alternatives to capitalism are very, very bad. I like to say capitalism is the worst form of economy except for all the others. So we have to heal capitalism, which I think is doable. The question to me is that wave that you were talking about, Ethan, are leaders going to have the courage to change before people pick up guns and start shooting each other?
But one of the mechanisms that we had to force leadership to change has been weakened And we're seeing a model in Europe and in Canada that seems to be going in a direction of healing, in that government delegated the employee rights bargaining to the free market with the invention of unions, so they could be less involved. And then government took and tried to destroy unions, and now there isn't a lever for employees to be able to leverage that power to focus change. Where Europe has stepped in is that not only are unions tend to be growing and more prevalent, but the government has taken a more active role to say, we're going to codify into our laws and governance of our nation that employers have to have certain things in that contract, so that when people go to work, they know they're going to get X, Y, and Z. To some point, but Germany's considered, has one of the most productive workforces in the world. If you work for Germany, it is nearly impossible for you to be fired in the first 5 years of your employment.
So two competing thoughts.
Yeah.
Which both ultimately come out of exactly what you just said, Thomas. On the one hand, we're seeing the modeling of that here in the United States as people in that Gen Z alpha category are now thinking about and talking about not pursuing higher education. And so their path straight through is to go find a trade, don't incur the significant debt of a higher education degree and go into some kind of trade program. So we're seeing a little bit of the movement there to model Germany and other highly unionized post-industrial nations. We're seeing
And I'm
that.
glad you brought up the trades, because if you think about how a trade business is run,
We're seeing that. So
we're seeing much more of that flatter, no middle management, leaders step up to lead teams, but it's a much flatter model than corporate America.
But we still have to figure out how to take that model, and we have answers, but they're not proliferating fast enough. We still have to figure out how to take the model that you describe, Ethan, and that you're just talking about, Thomas, and have it empower well-being, right? Because the contract used to be, you give me a paycheck, I turn it into well-being, and that doesn't work anymore. And so, for all of the discussion of culture and changing hierarchical structures, and those conversations are essential. At the end of the day, one of the things we have to figure out is how to close this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, to recreate a middle class, right? How do we do that? And there are answers to that. One of them, I think, is employee ownership, which only makes sense in the context of that flatter structure. And I think that's the easiest and shortest pathway to starting to bring some healing. But fundamentally, why would someone go to work for a corporation that they know will lay them off as soon as it's advantageous, not for the business, but for the shareholders, right? Will literally treat them like a battery that they can drain for profit, burn out, ruin, right? Like, has no commitment to their well-being, all the while the leaders of that company, and this data is still really prevalent, more than 3/4 of the C-suite believes they're empowering well-being for their workforce, while less than 32% of employees feel like work is empowering their well-being. Leaders are not getting it. And until that changes,
And one of the reasons is because of that pyramid structure, though,
yeah,
is because there's so many layers of management below that C-suite, and that they are not seeing that frontline workforce. They're hearing about it in these news stories, but then they have these middle managers saying, "There's no problem here."
So what?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that needs to happen in order for that healing to occur is that flatter structure needs to be there, so that the people that are in charge, that are the visionaries, that are the ones that are supposed to inspire their workforce, that want to do the right thing, actually have that visibility and communication. And you've seen attempts for them to try and do that through employee surveys and things like that. But to give you an example of how well that goes, one of the last things that happened that drove me to leave Citizens Bank is I was the branch manager. Our regional manager came in. We reviewed survey feedback for the entire region together, and critical comments he was able to point out on that survey who it was and why he disagreed with them, which to me had
Yeah.
a very chilling effect of I should not say anything that is critical because this is the mindset of the people that I report to.
So, yeah, and I just kind of want to be sensitive to time, and I do
Yeah.
want to kind of get some like thoughts from you both as far as closing comments. But I'll share a thought that I have that I hope marries together both of your perspectives because I really value your insight. So I really want to get back to Thomas, taking what you just said and tie it into something Jervis said, which if we start with a fundamental premise, which is the traditional model of capitalism is dead, but
Yep.
we've seen the alternatives and they're not preferable. So then maybe Jervis, a response to the question of what's the alternative? The alternative is reimagining capitalism as, and I'll say it the way I'm seeing it now in my work with Chasing the Dream, the podcast, and my consulting, the new model is called conscious capitalism. And it's a 4P model. So it's people, planet, profit, and probity, which is just moral compass. Companies like Southern California's Morningstar, not the ratings company, but the tomato company. They have 500 full-time employees. They have like 1,500 to 3,000 seasonal workers. They pick tomatoes. They're a $1 billion company. They have no manager titles, no structure. It's a true bona fide what you said, Thomas. It's an ESOP. And so they're set up so that their employees own it, their employees run it, their employees bring in the talent based on what they need. Their senior leadership only exists for one reason: to provide the resources, the support, the guidance, the tools that their people need to transform. And so anything else that gets in the way of that is destroyed. And how did that company come into being? Tim Roof, the founder, used to go surfing with Yvon Chouinard, who started Patagonia. And they would just hang out and they would smoke whatever. And they'd sit on the beach in the 1970s and they'd talk about creating a modern business built on ethics. And I think that's the model for what Jervis is saying moving forward. We need more Patagonias who just took $3 billion in family fortune and put it in a foundation to deal with climate change. That's
100%. My fear is that it's not happening, and I will have to bounce here in just a couple minutes, guys.
yeah.
But, you know, like I went to, I actually spoke at a B Labs event here recently. So
Oh, okay.
a whole group of B Labs owners, and there's, you know, so much of that squishiness that you just talked about, although employee ownership is an entirely different thing and very appropriate. And actually, Patagonia is really well run too, and invest in their people very intentionally. But so many of these, even these B Corps, and this is changing, by the way. I don't know if you if either of you are aware of this, but they're moving from a score-based rubric to a binary rubric, meaning it's going from you know, you get scoring in all of their categories to pass fail. Okay, which I think
they're changing the model. So it's either
the
pass fail across the categories that are measured. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yep. But if you look at the vast majority of B Corps where they're barely passing or not passing in the current scoring model, which I'm sad is going away, is employee financial well-being. So they're doing really well in purpose, and they're taking care of the environment, and they're you know, loving on their communities, and that's all great. But the contract is still broken if your employees can't turn work into well-being and you're not empowering that. And so I mean I try not to be pessimistic, but there are not enough leaders with the moral courage to not, you know, forget about this stuff is all important. You know, you said you might want to talk about DEI, but for a second, let's set aside justice. Let's set aside righteousness. Let's set aside consciousness, conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And let's just go back to the fundamental reason people work, which is to empower a better life for themselves and their children. and the people they love. If that isn't happening, none of that other stuff matters. And so we've got to figure out very quickly and very aggressively how we fix that fundamental problem. ESOPs are such a great example. Not only do they do a lot of the justice things, but they are a get rich slow scheme, which really incentivizes loyalty. It incentivizes sticking around. It incentivizes you taking ownership of your work because you can directly benefit and profit from that. And so, yeah, we've got to find our way into more structures like that, because otherwise, all this squishy stuff, which is super important. I spend a lot of my time on justice work, but it won't matter if people can't put food on.
The squishy stuff is decades of data to support the consensus, which we all have, which is we need new leaders, Jervis, who empower worker lives. So that's the takeaways. We fundamentally need a new model, whatever you want to call it, that accounts for putting people who commit to the organizations into a better set of circumstances, a better future. And when we have that, we'll know we've reached a more enlightened essence of capitalism is what my takeaway. I do want to follow up with you offline, Jervis, to talk about a few things. So if we could schedule that onto the agenda.
Let's do it.
Thomas, any kind of thoughts? I mean, your impressions about today, or
I think there's a big difference between what we know is going to work and what people are actually going to implement. And I think that I'm in agreement with basically everything that Jarvis is saying and you're saying. It's just that I've had visibility to what the roadblocks are. And one of the major roadblocks that when you go to encounter change like this is that what you're talking about is fundamentally restructuring the organizations of power. And the people in power are not going to let go of that power voluntarily. And we have to be able to adapt how we proceed in the future, knowing that that's the reality that we're facing. And it is something that is institutionalized in every aspect, in the investor side of business, in the governance side of business, in the governance side of government. It's still, our government is that pyramid structure, right?
my takeaway is that we need more people to be talking about these issues.
Yes, we need more people
Agreed.
to talk about this. We need more people in power to drive this change.
Yeah.
It's not
Thank you,
something-
gentlemen. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.